Our guest today is a returning guest, but it's been a long time since we've had her. Linda Strohschein, founder of Strohschein Law Group. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good. So we're going to just kind of jump right in. You have a new book, and it's called "You're Not Alone: Living as an Alzheimer's Caregiver." So what is it about, and what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah. So actually, we have two books. They're both very small, but they're both called "You're Not Alone." One is focused more on the caregiver, as you mentioned, and the other one is focused more on the person who has Alzheimer's or who has some sort of dementia. Because often in this discussion, we find that their voice is not heard quite as much as it should be. Right. You know, just because that person can't make the best decisions they used to be able to make, they still have the right to their opinion.
That's a very important concept that sometimes gets lost in certain circles. Yes.
It does. But getting back to the caregiver book, so obviously it is focused on the caregiver, someone who is taking care of another person with Alzheimer's or with dementia. And why did we write it? Well, because this story needs to be told. We see every day families who are struggling with what's the next step? How do we manage this? How do we make these choices? And as you and I were talking about just before we started today, some of that changing dynamic where you used to be the child in the relationship and now maybe you're parenting your parent.
That's so different mindset than being the child. Yeah. So in the book, you talk about more than just Alzheimer's. You talk about some of the other dementias, things that cause dementias.
Yes. So these two books really are focused mostly on Alzheimer's disease. What we know is that there are about 100 different types of dementia out there. Alzheimer's makes up 60% of that. And there are really about 10 different categories. So vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, there's a couple others here. Alzheimer's, of course, Lewy body dementia. Those are some of the ones we hear about not nearly as often. And there are definitely some overlapping issues for that caregiver because that person is losing the ability to make good decisions. We're actually coming out with another book this year that talks a little bit more specifically about the different types of dementia because they really do come out very differently. You know, when I hear about an individual with dementia who's maybe more angry than they ever were, they weren't necessarily an angry person before, but they are now, is that, you know what, that's somewhat of a hallmark of vascular dementia. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV or the radio, but there's definitely hallmarks to the different diseases. There are some where that individual can't even see their deficits. Whereas the person with Alzheimer's often does. They know they can't find the word. They know they can't find things in their house. But there's some types of dementia that individual doesn't have any insight.
I was was doing some training recently over in another suburb, and a loved one brought up an aspect that I had never thought about before, was when an individual doesn't recognize themselves or pictures of themselves or themselves in a mirror and I never really that whole disconnect, that it's such a sad thing.
It is.
So what are some of the tools of survival for caregivers?
Well, we do have a lot of them, but in some broad categories, we talk a lot about good communication. And we've got actually many of them that we're going to talk about in a minute, but so that's a broad category. Talking about the caregiver's health, making sure that they are well taken care of. And that caregiver, I see frequently, that caregiver who is burning themselves out and they get to a point they just can't do it any longer. So we often talk about that caregiver being the frog in the pot. Have you ever
frog is boiling?
Well, if the frog jumped into a pot of boiling water, they would know it's hot and they would jump out. Right? But the frog who is in the pot and the heat just gets turned up a little bit more every day doesn't know it's getting that hot because you're kind of just used to it. So oftentimes with that caregiver, especially the spouse, then the well spouse is often the frog in the pot because it's just a little bit harder today than it was yesterday. And I got through yesterday, so I can get through today. Before you know it, they should jump out of the pot, but they don't. We talk about the different stages of Alzheimer's
Yep.
because someone who's very early in that progression, very different than someone who is a moderate, someone who's very late stage, just different things that they show. Some of the other tools to survive, making sure the legal things are taken care of, powers of attorney for healthcare and property, maybe a will or trust if that's appropriate. So there's some things that really can make that caregiver's job a whole lot easier if they're put in place at the right time.
Something recently, last Friday, I had a conversation with someone about their loved one that had been in the hospital, and this I could tell there was an educational component of just what's going to happen to your loved one that's in mid to late stage dementia in a hospital setting. It's just, you can, some of the things are just going to kind of go with the territory once they go.
And being prepared for that.
Yes.
Having that to-go bag. So when you do have to run to the hospital, you're prepared.
Yep.
Or knowing that maybe it's time to stay with that loved one because they're not going to really be able to respond appropriately. We want to make sure they get the best medical care possible.
Yep.
And if they can't advocate for themselves, perhaps it's time you need to stay with them.
And that's what I was sort of hearing is, the hospital was like the big bad wolf, but it was like the hospital needs some help here.
Right, because they can only do so much.
Yeah. So let's just jump right into, the 10 communication tools. Number 1 is fascinating. Never argue, instead agree. Why is this such a critically important tool?
This one's number 1 for a good reason.
Yeah.
So never argue, but agree. Your loved one could be saying that the sky is purple. Does it really make that much important? Does it make that much difference if he or she says that? No, it really doesn't. So to the extent that there's no impact, agree. Agree, because then it's a little bit easier for you as the caregiver. It's a whole lot easier for that person, who has the dementia. It's a whole lot easier overall to go to their reality than to make them come back to ours. Right. And there was a real significant change in the industry some years ago, where we used to try to re-educate them.
Yes.
And it just doesn't make it. It's not that important.
Validation is kind of where the mindset is now. Yeah. So do you think that there's a component of caregiver burnout why the argument, the tension maybe is kind of
because of that
up.
Argumentation? Absolutely. Yeah. Because as a caregiver, if you spend your whole day trying to convince that person that X or Y or Z is true and they're not going to buy it, you're kind of spinning your wheels.
It's a long day.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And so number 2 is never reason is unable to be processed. It is best to change the subject and divert.
Yes. Right. Yeah. So never reason. Divert the topic. Change the subject. Yeah. And I don't often compare my senior clients who have dementia to young families, right? But this is exactly what we did with our young children, right? When they said, I want a cookie and they couldn't have one. Right. You didn't talk to them about why they can't have a cookie because they don't understand that dinner's coming in 20 minutes and that's the healthy food and we're not having a cookie right now. And so again, just focusing on what that person with dementia can manage. They can't manage the information just like it was before.
Do you think some of that is up at the beginning. Yep. So, do you think some of that's rooted in the adult child, kind of a little bit of denial and staying in a role when they're making it harder on themselves? Yep.
Yeah, that really does make a huge difference.
So how about, I've seen this unfortunately too many times in 17 years, never shame or embarrass, instead distract.
Right. Unfortunately, we do see when the caregiver feels that person with dementia, they should be able to get dressed. They should be able to empty the dishwasher. They should be able to follow through on those instructions. Right. And it's perhaps a way that couple fought before, or that parent-child fought before. But things are different now. And it's really hard because the person may look the exact same. And it's really hard to understand that there's something going on in the brain. Right. It's not usually that person who is trying to be defiant. they just can't any longer.
Right.
And it's hard to change that perspective.
Right. And a simple way to me to think about it is like those emotions are in the amygdala, and they say that amygdala, those memories stay longer, but these little facts or things you're arguing about, it's kind of in that hippocampus where they're going to get devastated by the dementia.
I would agree with that.
Those feelings and that kind of dynamics in the family, that's that old emotions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How about lecturing? You see that sometimes? Just
I do.
Yep.
Caregivers who are trying to lecture about the, pros and cons of whatever. Of course, we're going to go to the grocery store. Of course, just being able to reassure that person who has dementia, because again, the brain is not functioning the way it should be.
Yep.
Things are not, and not a very medical definition here, but things are not connecting the way they should be.
Right.
And so to sit here and lecture that person, it just makes them feel bad because they don't really understand what you're saying. So I often tell my clients that their parent, their spouse, used to be able to go into the closet each morning and decide which of 30 shirts they wanted to wear today. Is it cold? Is it warm? Is it spring? Is it fall? What color? What, but they might not be able to do that. They might still be able to choose between the red shirt and the blue shirt.
2 or 3 options.
Right. But they can't choose from 30. So again, if we're trying to lecture that person, they don't get it. It's like it's going right over their head. And based on what we know about that person, it shouldn't, but it is. It's going over their head. So why lecture? That's not going to get you anywhere. Just reassure them that they're safe. We've got it. You're comfortable, trying to bring that sense of comfort, because that's at the very core, that's what we all want.
I was watching a YouTube recently about a lady named Olive was her name, and she had vascular dementia, and she put it, the sentence I remember of the whole thing was, they tell me she had vascular dementia, and she said, all I know is it's random where it's going to affect me at, so, and that's kind of the way to look at dementia. They should be able to do things, but it could be random tomorrow.
Right.
It's not guaranteed that they can still do whatever that is. How about remember, using the word remember?
So this is where I see a lot of families, if they're going to visit their loved one in a facility, or they're just coming from their day-to-day life, going back to visit mom and dad at home. And so they might say, remember, I'm Linda. That's not actually very helpful.
Just like, hi, I'm Linda.
Right.
Whatever.
Or to be able to look at some pictures. So often we bring the scrapbook, and that's a great thing. But instead of saying, who's this? Like you're trying to test that person.
Right.
That's not going to get us very far. But to look at that picture and say, oh, that's the family picnic that we had at Lake Holiday. I think that's Cousin Tom.
Tell a story.
Exactly. And so then the person with dementia has an easy out. Either they remember and they say, yeah, I think that is Tom. We had so much fun that day. You remember when we covered up so-and-so with sand? Or if they don't remember, they don't really have to disclose that, or challenge you. They just say, oh, yeah, that might be Tom.
Yeah.
Right. So again, just taking out that difficulty, making it a little bit easier. Let's smooth that path.
Right. That makes perfect sense. So that's kind of the first big 5 there. Huh?
Right. We got a few more there.
Yeah. So this, I told you so, or I've told you that already. That's another form of
right. And that's very difficult for the caregiver, because that loved one with dementia might say 17 times in a row, what's today's date?
Yeah.
And so that caregiver has an option. They can become argumentative. I told you already 15 times or 17 times. Try to repeat that information, because it is that person learning that information new. And when their short-term memory is not great, it does go in and go out. What is that? In one ear, out the other.
Yeah. That's
and
so true.
So if that's difficult for the caregiver, try to regroup. Try to step outside, take a deep breath, because it's not that person's fault.
No,
it's not. Disease. It's not something they are causing.
Yeah. How about the word like you can't? Always focusing on the deficits.
Yeah. Let's just try to bring out the positive. Maybe they can't drive, but be able to say, let's go for a ride. Or, instead of focusing on the fact that they can't drive, you know what, how about we go for an ice cream cone? That's kind of also that redirection that we talked about, because it's so much easier to go for an ice cream cone, even if you went for one this morning.
Right.
That's this is the time in their life that maybe we do a couple extra of those things.
Enjoy
because
things.
It's not important to focus on not being able to drive.
Right.
Or this is also very similar when our loved one with dementia says, I want to go home. And that strikes fear in the hearts of many of the caregivers, especially the adult children, because they say, oh, but I sold the house. You can't go home. Right? We sold the house because we needed to pay for their care, to make sure they're well cared for.
Right.
And it's really, really important to understand that when your loved one with dementia is asking to go home, it is not the four walls that we're talking about.
Right.
They could be sitting in their very own living room for the last 50 years and say, I want to go home.
Right.
And that's when clients say, oh, I get it. It's not the four walls. It's the feeling of comfort.
Yeah.
Right? Because we all have a home and we all feel comfortable. Hopefully we feel comfortable there. And that's what we're trying to accomplish. That person who has dementia, when they say, I want to go home, it's not because of the four walls they're in or where they want to go. It's that feeling of comfort, because home for the most part is comfortable. And the diagnosis of dementia, again, the brain's not working properly. And so it just doesn't feel comfortable. Everything feels off. So I want to go home.
So they're telling you that there's some insecurity in there.
Right. So instead of arguing with them about how you had to sell the house, just say, you know what, tell me about your home. What feels comfortable about that? Or let's go get an ice cream cone.
Divert again. And condescending, that's also a negative thing, right?
Obviously, just looking for encouragement and praise. No, maybe they can't read a book or read the newspaper like they used to, but you can certainly praise them for setting the kitchen table or, following through even on something small that might not have been a big deal before, but it is now.
Or forcing to do things that they don't want to do. Or a certain piece of clothing to put on or whatever. Like, we're going to church, Mom, dress up.
And it's okay. Right? It's okay if their shirt doesn't match the pants or what have you. It's, again, that encouragement, praise, that positive reinforcement to help that person through the day, because it's not worth it for the caregiver or the patient to focus on those negatives.
It's a lose-lose if you don't change up your approach.
It is.
So now you have this tip to always put your own mask on first. What's that we're talking about?
Yeah. So remember when probably the last time you flew on the airplane, they gave that safety announcement and they say if the cabin loses pressure, then they're going to, that mask is going to come down from behind the storage unit. And they say, if you're traveling with small children, put your mask on first so then you can help them.
So.
Right? Same situation, because if you don't have oxygen, you can't help that small child next to you.
Right.
If you're the caregiver, you need to put your mask on first. You need to take care of yourself. And I know that's really, really difficult to do, but being able to respond when family or friends say, oh, just call me if you need anything. You know what? Have a little list in your phone or in your pocket and say, you know what? I need you to go to the can you go to the grocery store for me? Can you sit with my dad for 30 minutes while I just run out real quick?
Right.
People are well-intended, but they don't know what you need.
You got to ask.
You got to ask, and you got to take care of yourself and find time in your day to do that.
Sure. How about let's kind of, before we run out of time, let's talk about a little bit from kind of your role as an attorney and how this kind of factors in. So when someone has dementia, what kind of planning ahead needs to have taken place?
That's a really good question. And a lot of the things we see is making sure those estate planning documents are in place. And really my primary focus for that individual with dementia is, do they have those powers of attorney in place? Now, you might be aware there's two different kinds of powers of attorney in Illinois: power of attorney for healthcare, power of attorney for property. Both of these documents allow us to name someone to step in as a decision maker. So really anyone over the age of 18 should have both of these documents, because it's not just a dementia situation, right?
No.
Any one of us can get hit by a bus, including
so
our college kids. So making sure that if your loved one gets this diagnosis, run to the lawyer. go get those forms. Even if you pull them off the statutory forms that are online, make sure it's signed and witnessed and notarized properly. There's instructions right there on the form. You might not expect that the lawyer is going to say, go get a form online, but I'd rather you have that than nothing at all.
Yep.
And if it's too scary to go see the lawyer, get that in place. Because if we don't have that in place and that person loses capacity, our next step is going into guardianship court. It's expensive. It's time consuming. It's not private at all.
And what the family could handle internally can't be handled that way any longer.
Because the judge has a big say in what happens in guardianship, because the judge is responsible for that individual who's disabled. So it's really important to take a look at what's in place. Those powers of attorney, they're relatively simple to get, but they are so very helpful.
Yeah. And some of these, and it's logical to think about some of the things we've talked about earlier in the conversation where simple things get difficult. These are not simple things, and they're not going to be helped by the fact that you can't reason it out with your loved one that has dementia always through all these things, because even when everyone is like-minded and cognitively okay, those aren't easy subjects.
Right. Or I have the adult child who says, oh, mom's fine. Well, she's over at the memory care facility where she has a diagnosis of dementia, but she's fine. Well, not so much. Once we know that there's certain factors in place, I need to hear it from the doctor that this person has capacity before we can really move on to something else.
And that's everyone doesn't think about that. So before time gets away, how about talk about Medicare and Medicaid a bit and how that figures into the long-term care of individuals with dementia.
Right. So Medicare is our health insurance. When we're 65 and older, that plays a part in our health insurance coverage. Medicare will pay for up to 100 days in the nursing home. So if you've gone to the hospital, you were there for a certain amount of days, then you go to the nursing home for rehabilitation, Medicare covers up to 100 days, just beyond 3 months. Beyond that, then we turn to Medicare, then we turn to private pay. And most facilities in our area are in the range of about $8,000 to $10,000 per month. And some of them are a little bit more than that. So families often come into my office and they say, so mom's got $100,000 left, but we see the writing on the wall. How do we hide the money? And so we have to have a conversation and say, well, we're not hiding anything. But there are still very legitimate planning methods that we can use. Even when someone is on the doorstep of the nursing home, we can still protect about 50% of what's left. So just knowing we've got some great options out there.
Within the law, and everyone doesn't realize that.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. So let's see how we're doing on. So now, in your practice, you talk to folks about estate planning and then some Medicare planning if something goes wrong, Medicare, Medicaid planning. Any other things we'd like to touch on in your practice that would be helpful for folks to know?
Well, again, I think focusing on those powers of attorney, so very important, making sure that we're not just looking at the individual who has dementia, but we're looking at their caregiver as well.
Both.
Because it really is so important. You know, if we've got a husband and wife situation, and let's just pick on the guy for a moment. Let's say he's got the diagnosis. She's trying to take care of him. But what happens if she now has some medical event? She's in the hospital for a couple of days. And so we often say, let's get a caregiver in place, just like what you guys do. Let's get a caregiver in place, even for a few hours here and there. So if now there's an emergency, they can call up and say, Kathy, now I need someone full time.
And that
and I need them right.
Yeah,
and happens. So just to kind of have that background. Or we also tell families, go take a look at some of the facilities out there. Now, what you and I know is that they are not all nursing homes, are they?
Oh, no.
There's so many great options between independent and supportive and assisted living, memory care, and of course the nursing home when we need it. But we were just talking about some great options earlier, that there are so many options that weren't there even 5 or 10 years ago. There's actually a brand new facility going up on the corner right by my house. You know, so it's been interesting seeing it go up, and it's independent and assisted and memory care, I believe, is how it's going to open. And right there on the corner, the main building, it looks like they have balconies. And when I came up one day, I'm like, how do they have memory care with balconies? That doesn't sound safe.
Yeah.
Then as they continue to build the building, we realize there's another building towards the back. That's probably memory care because there's no balconies
safer.
there.
Yes.
Great windows, great facility, but.
And it's always good to do homework because you can have nice buildings, but the service is where it really counts.
Right. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
And we tell families, no matter what level of care you're looking at, let's try to make good decisions based on the level of care that's being provided, not what the curtains look like.
Right.
Because some of the best places out there have terrible curtains.
Right.
And it's really important to make good choices based on care, not on aesthetics. Now, if we can get both, well, that's a holy grail, I think.
Yeah, it's a win-win. Yeah. Okay. But tell us a little bit about how we can get in contact with you if someone wants to follow up after the show.
Sure. Our main office is in St. Charles, and we do also have a new satellite office in Wheaton. We just opened that in April of this year. But our phone number is 630-377-3241. We also have a website at StrohscheinLawGroup.com. That might be a little difficult to spell. There's a lot of vowels in there.
Yeah, there you go.
But my hunch is it's going to be on a link on the website or what have you.
Cool.
There is.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So you look on the Facebook page for WRMN and it's there. Yep.
Exactly.
WRMN 1410 Radio on Facebook. Yep.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you. Well, thank you, Linda, for being our guest today.
Thank you very much for having me.